Night on August 22nd, 2005, 38-year-old Rick Eck knocked on the front door of an apartment in the tiny Midwestern farm town of Claremont, Illinois. As Rick waited for the door to open, he could barely stand still because he was so excited about what he was going to be doing that night. Finally, the door swung open, and Rick saw right in front of him this very skinny and gaunt-looking woman with dark hair and dark eyes staring back at him. Her name was Irenia Kottner, and she was 34 years old, and by day, she worked at Walmart, but at night, she became the real version of herself. She was a witch who actually led a group of witches known as a coven that Rick was a part of. Without saying anything, Irenia motioned for Rick to follow her into her apartment, and then Irenia turned and began walking away. And Rick, before stepping over the threshold, he paused for a moment and just turned to the guy he had brought with him, a tall, muscular man named David Lindner. And Rick, he just kind of nodded at David, and David nodded back, and then the two of them walked inside. As Rick and David followed Irenia into her apartment, Rick still could barely contain his excitement. He had only joined this coven recently, about a year and a half ago, and so witchcraft, which is something they were going to be doing that night, was kind of new to him, but it was very exciting. Rick had been inspired to become a witch and join this coven after watching the Harry Potter movies, and so he was hopeful that tonight would go something like Harry Potter. And Rick knew David, the guy he had brought along, was this very powerful warlock, which is a male witch, and so he figured, if David's here, this is bound to go to plan. Rick just hoped he'd be able to keep up with David, or at least play some sort of meaningful support role. Irenia eventually led Rick and David down this dark hallway to this small living room where in the middle of the floor was a ring of lit candles. And as soon as Rick and David stepped into the room with Irenia, they were hit with this powerful smell of incense that had been burning in the room. And also there was all this smoke hovering in the air from the various things that Irenia had been burning in preparation for tonight's event. Rick, David, and Irenia walked quietly into the middle of this circle of candles, and they sat down cross-legged in a circle facing each other, and then they got ready to begin. Life in the town of Claremont was normally very quiet and peaceful. I mean, this is a town that literally has more cornfields than people, and Claremont was over 100 miles away from the nearest city. But beneath the calm exterior, Claremont had a dark side. Amongst the 200 or so residents of Claremont were several very dark witches. Not this coven, not Irenia, Rick, and David. They were the good guys. The dark witches, they were kind of out and about in this town and doing bad things, like practicing evil magic and evil witchcraft. And so this coven, led by Irenia, was actually in place to try to combat these evil witches in their midst. And tonight, Rick, David, and Irenia were going to attempt to perform their most ambitious and important magic yet. The coven was going to attempt to break a powerful hex, which is kind of like a curse. And this hex was cast by a person who might very well be the worst of all the dark witches in Claremont, a 16-year-old girl named Lindsay Cassinger. As Rick sat cross-legged in the middle of the circle, he found himself staring at the two slightly bigger candles that sat in the dead center of the circle, that were basically right between Rick, David, and Irenia. And David, as he stared at these two candles, he saw etched in each of the candles' bodies were words. On one candle it said Lindsay, and on the other candle it was etched baby, because it would turn out this very evil dark witch, Lindsay, was pregnant. And so instead of having to combat one dark soul, the coven would have to combat two, because Lindsay and her baby were kind of intertwined. Now, before this night, the coven had attempted several times to try to break this hex that Lindsay had cast. And the coven believed initially this hex was actually cast directly at Irenia, because Irenia was suffering from things like depression and anxiety and not finding love. And so, of course, that had to be a product of this curse. And as the coven had continued to try and fail at breaking this hex, the hex had only become more powerful and begun to spread from Irenia to other witches in this coven who actually were not present this particular night, including a 20-year-old woman who began complaining of depression and ever-worsening headaches, which of course had to be because of this hex. And so that was why, on this night, the coven had decided to really beef up their attack on this hex, and so that was why Rick had gone out and brought in David, the experienced warlock from St. Louis, Missouri, who claimed he had broken a hex before and he could do it again for them. As Rick, Irenia, and Dave all sat in the circle, they looked at each other, and then they began chanting in unison to bring out the dead, to join them in the living room right now. And as they began this chant, Rick found himself intensely staring at those two candles with Lindsay and Baby on them. And as he stared at the flames dancing across the top of them, Rick started to feel like he was kind of drifting off into a trance-like state. And he knew that based on his prior teachings from Irenia, the leader of this coven, that this must be what it feels like when the spirit world opens up, which means the dead really were coming into the room. And then, as Rick is kind of dealing with this trance-like state, he heard Irenia begin to talk, but it wasn't her normal voice. It was the slow and deep-sounding voice, almost like something had inhabited her body and taken it over and was now speaking through her mouth. And Irenia, in this kind of slow and strange voice, she would tell Rick and David that the curse is still growing. And then she would say something that totally caught Rick by surprise. She said, again in that slow, strange voice, that the hex now was also on Rick and his entire family, and if they didn't break this hex immediately, Rick and his family would all perish. And when Rick heard this, he's still in this trance-like state, but his heart began racing because he didn't know this hex could potentially affect his loved ones. And so this was a really big deal. They needed to end this hex tonight. Rick listened intently as Irenia began to say in this strange voice what their plan was for that night to break this hex. Basically, Rick and David were going to perform a sacred ritual, and Irenia, she began to say to the spirits in the room that Rick and David, they were ready, but they needed help. And so after she said this, she went quiet, and so too did Rick and David, and they're all just sitting there kind of waiting for something to happen. And then after about a minute of just total silence, Irenia began to speak again, still in this strange, slow, bizarre voice, but Rick and David knew now it was a different voice coming out of her. Now Irenia was speaking on behalf of the spirit world that was in the room with them. And Irenia, she would say in this voice, "I grant you 5 demons to help you on your quest to break this hex." And then after saying this, Irenia, she opened her eyes and she looked kind of confused for a moment, and then she kind of got her bearings and she looked at David and Rick and she told them now in her normal voice that they had to perform this sacred ritual before the 2 candles in the middle with Lindsay and Baby etched on them burned out. And so basically, Rick and David, they needed to get this done tonight. Then Irenia handed David a sacred tool that would be used that night in this sacred ritual that David and Rick were going to complete. And then Rick and David, they would stand up to leave, and before they left, Irenia would give them the typical witch send-off, which was, "Blessed be." And then Rick and David, they nodded their heads, they turned and walked out of the apartment, and as soon as they were out into the night, Rick could have sworn he saw dark shadows moving around all over the place. And he knew right then and there that he and David would be safe that night, because clearly the shadows moving around had to be those 5 demons that Irenia had called forth from the spirit world to protect them this night. And so feeling very safe and empowered, Rick and David went straight into Rick's car. Rick turned it on and pulled away from the curb and began heading towards their destination. The other day, old Seagull Lung was looking pretty down, and so naturally, I offered him some of my iced wildebeest retinas to suck on, but he just shook his head and said, "Dad, thank you, but what I really need right now is, a bloodthirsty horde of zombies to descend on this town so I can savagely destroy them with various DIY weaponry." But alas, zombies aren't real, and so my dream will never come true. And at this point, I just slapped Lung right across the face, and I said, "Lung, are you kidding me? You ever heard of a little thing called DLS? Doomsday Last Survivor? You kidding me? They literally have trillions of zombies you can slaughter right now. You kidding me? Come here, let me explain to you what this is. In Doomsday, you enter a dark, post-apocalyptic world filled with your beloved bloodthirsty zombies, and it's up to you to strategize and survive their wrath. You can customize shelters, and you can even recruit heroes with their own special abilities that will help you slaughter all these zombies. And right now, you have a chance at some of the $5,000 cash that's up for grabs for playing this game. You can be a lone survivor, or you can join forces with other players and alliances to try to withstand the zombie invasion. Heck, if you get lucky, you might even be able to join me and old Seagull Lung's alliance. tickets. And for a limited time only, you can earn a special rare name tag that shows off you're part of the Ballin' Squad when you download the game using my link. And remember, there's $5,000 cash up for grabs right now. To potentially win some of that money, click the link in the description below, download the game, and then in the page, you'll see there's something called a Might ranking, and the top 3 people in that ranking walk away with up to $1,000 each. Outside of that ranking, many other players will be chosen for cash prizes, some up to $100 each. Hurry and download Doomsday right now so you can join the limited time events and earn the legendary hero Jaden. The next zombie wave arrives in 8 hours, so come and join me and old Seagull Vlog now! A few miles away, at the house where the 16-year-old evil witch, Lindsay Kassinger, lived, a 20-year-old Army private named Joshua Bennett was sitting at the kitchen table in Lindsay's house, eating chicken wings and just kind of enjoying his night. Josh didn't know Lindsay very well, but he wasn't at her house to see Lindsay. He was at her house to see his own mother. And Josh and his mother had a lot of catching up to do. She had abandoned him and his father when he was young, and so Josh's dad had raised him, and then when Josh was old enough, he had joined the military, and now he was about to deploy to the Middle East to go to war. But unexpectedly, Josh's father had died, and so Josh had come back to Illinois for the funeral, and it was at the funeral where he saw his mother. She was in attendance as well, and, even though he was upset with his mother for abandoning him, he felt like, I want to reconnect with her. And so he'd gone over and he'd given her a hug, and his mother had been so touched that she had asked Josh to come by her house in Claremont, Illinois, where she lived with her boyfriend, because she really wanted some alone time to actually hear about Josh's life and kind of, get back together again. And so, of course, Josh had said yes. And so here he was at this house in Claremont. Now, Josh had arrived at this house a little bit earlier, and he was surprised to discover that it was not just his mother and her boyfriend living there, but also his mother's boyfriend's son, whose name was Jackie, was also living there, along with his pregnant girlfriend, the evil witch, Lindsay Kassinger. But Josh didn't really mind that there was extra people. It was just maybe a little bit confusing that this was kind of a big roommate situation. But it seemed like Jackie and his girlfriend Lindsay were very nice people, and they quickly went downstairs to the apartment in the basement and kind of just stayed out of the way so Josh and his mother could catch up. And so after Josh finished eating his wings, his mother came into the kitchen and the two of them chatted for hours, and then finally at about midnight that night, Josh decided to go to bed, so he said goodnight to his mom, he retreated to the bedroom, and he laid in bed. But he couldn't really sleep right away because he had a lot going on in his life. I mean, he had just lost his dad a couple of weeks ago, and then at the same time, he had reconnected with his estranged mother, and he's about to deploy to Iraq, to a war zone, and, he felt ready for that, but at the same time, he was kind of apprehensive, it's about to happen, I hope I'll be able to do my job. And so with all these kind of intense thoughts swirling around his head, he just kind of laid there and didn't really expect to sleep anytime soon. But eventually, Josh did fall asleep. However, it felt like he had only been asleep for a couple of minutes when he was abruptly woken up by the sound of barking coming out from the kitchen. Jackie's dog was going crazy. And so Josh grabbed his phone and he checked the time and saw it was 3 a.m. And so instead of going out there and dealing with this dog, he just thought, it's going to stop eventually. And so Josh grabbed his pillow and he put it over his head and tried to muffle the sounds so he could fall back asleep. But it didn't work. The dog just kept on barking. And then when Josh took the pillow off his head and kind of sat up wondering what he should do about this dog situation, he heard the sound of a man's voice, a stranger's voice, saying, "I bring you forth from the dark." And then after Josh heard this, he heard the sound of a woman screaming, and it sounded like his mom. And so acting on instinct, Josh leapt from his bed, he ran out of the room, and he goes into the kitchen, and he sees the dog is jumping and barking and going mad, and his mom is screaming, and there's this guy grabbing her, kind of grappling with her, who's wearing black gloves and a ski mask, and there's another guy next to him with the same getup. It's absolute chaos. But before Josh could run over and save his mother, suddenly his chest felt like it was on fire, and then he went blind, and his eyes had this burning pain in them, and then he couldn't breathe, and he was stumbling backwards, barely able to stand. Minutes later, Rick, who was one of the witches from the coven, bolted out of the front door of Lindsay's house where all this chaos was happening, and he just took off running across the street directly into a cornfield. And as he ran, he felt this throbbing pain in his leg, and he could feel blood pooling in his shoe. Rick ran until he couldn't run any farther, and then he collapsed onto the ground, and then he began thinking about what an absolute disaster it had been inside of the evil witch's house. Not only had they failed to break the hex cast by Lindsay, but also Rick was concerned that David, his partner, who was still at the house, was dead. And Rick, he began looking around wildly, hoping all those demons that were sent to help them from the spirit world, he was hoping they'd be nearby and they'd know what to do. But Rick looked around and there was no one. And so Rick thought for a second, oh my gosh, Lindsay's hex must be stronger than any of us realize. We have to do something now. We have to end this before me and my family get killed too. And so Rick pulled out his phone and he called Irenia, the leader of the coven, to get her advice about what they should do next. But Irenia didn't respond to what Rick was saying the way he expected her to. Instead, she seemed very cold and almost enraged at what he was saying. And then, before Rick could kind of figure out what was going on with Irenia, he heard off in the distance the sound of sirens making their way to the evil witch's house. Over the next few days, police detectives would speak to everyone inside of Irenia's coven, as well as everyone who knew both Irenia and Lindsay. And slowly but surely, the police would put together what actually happened inside of Lindsay, the evil witch's house, in the early morning hours of August 23rd, 2005. At about 3 a.m. on August 23rd, 2005, Rick and David pulled up onto Lindsay's street and they parked their car a little ways away from Lindsay's house. And then after parking, Rick and David donned their ski masks and their gloves. And then after looking at each other and nodding, they hopped out and began walking towards Lindsay's house. Their plan was to sneak in through one of Lindsay's windows and confront Lindsay the evil witch directly and break the hex by performing a sacred ritual. And then after this ritual was over, they had a second ritual they would need to perform that would send Lindsay's evil soul through the gates of hell. And to do that, they needed the help of the 5 demons that had been sent along by Irenia from the spirit world. Now, Rick and David felt like this was a great plan. However, as soon as they got to Lindsay's house and David actually began trying to climb into one of the windows, everything fell apart. First, the dog began to bark inside of Lindsay's house, and that alerted Josh's mother, who came into the kitchen and sees the dog and sees David falling through the window. And Rick, who didn't really know what was happening inside the house, he just climbed through the window after David, and when he stood up in the kitchen, he realized it was too late. They were totally caught. And so Rick, not really knowing what to do, he's seeing all this yelling and chaos happening. He looks over at David and he sees David grab something from his belt and he pulls it out. And it was the tool that Irenia had given them when they left her apartment to go carry out this sacred ritual. This tool was part of that sacred ritual, and it was a long, sharp knife. And what they were going to do is stab the evil witch, Lindsay Cassinger, to death with it. That was how they were going to break the hex. And then after they killed Lindsay, they were going to perform this weird ritual with her clothing that would send her soul through the gates of hell. Now, Rick did understand that this was the plan. They were going to murder Lindsay, but perhaps he didn't really know how serious David was about carrying it out, or the fact that David was not really a warlock as much as he was a violent criminal who had bragged to Irenia about previously murdering someone who had cast a separate hex. And so by killing this person, that was how David had broken the hex previously. Also, Rick may not have known that David had been instructed by Irenia to not let anything stand in their way to break this hex, to carry out this sacred ritual on Lindsay. And so Rick just watched as David raised the knife and began stabbing Josh's mother over and over again in the chest while screaming, "I bring you forth from the dark." And it was at this point that Josh, the army private who heard all this happening, came charging out in his underwear into the kitchen, and Rick watched as David went from stabbing Josh's mother to turning and immediately stabbing Josh directly in the chest. And Rick, at this point, he just jumped right in on it and pulled out his pepper spray and sprayed Josh in the eyes. And so that was why Josh felt the burning sensation and then went blind and couldn't breathe and fell to the ground. And so now it is absolutely chaos inside of this kitchen, and the actual target of David and Rick's, Lindsay, the evil witch, she managed to run out of the house and run to a nearby neighbor's house to get help. Meanwhile, the evil witch's boyfriend, Jackie, he comes upstairs carrying a shotgun. And at this point, Josh is on the ground, clearly dying from the stab wound to his chest. His mother as well is struggling on the ground. And David is going totally nuts, saying all these strange things and whipping his knife around. And Rick is just totally panicking and doesn't know what to do. And so when Jackie ran at Rick with this shotgun, Rick pulled out his own knife and attempted to stab Jackie, but somehow missed Jackie and stabbed himself in the leg. And so that was why his leg was throbbing and bleeding, because he had stabbed himself. And then after Rick had stabbed himself, Jackie just walked over and Spartan kicked Rick down the stairs into the basement. And then Jackie turned his attention from Rick to David, who was still just going nuts with this knife and being a total maniac. And Jackie just walked over to David, and David, he sees the shotgun coming over to him, and he tries to move the barrel out of the way, but then somehow only manages to point the gun directly at his own stomach, at which point Jackie just fired a slug directly into David's gut. And it was at this moment, as David is crumpling to the ground with this horrible stomach wound, that the neighbor that Lindsay, the evil witch, had gone to go get, had come to the house. They went inside, and they found a scene of absolute carnage. And before the neighbor could even do anything, Rick, who had stabbed himself in the leg and been kicked down into the basement, had scrambled up the steps and just run right past all the bodies on the ground, past the neighbor who didn't even do anything, outside, and Rick just kept on running out into that cornfield. And so at this point, the neighbor didn't even try to figure out what happened. He just called 911. But it was already too late for Josh, the Army private, who was only at this house to reconnect with his estranged mother before he deployed to Iraq. And here he was, dead on the ground from this totally bizarre attack. It would turn out Rick, David, and really the entire coven of witches that fell under Irenia had been totally duped. They all fully believed that Lindsay was in fact an evil witch who had cast this hex on Irenia, which was spreading to all the other members of the coven. But in reality, Irenia, the leader of this coven, she didn't believe there was a hex. That had nothing to do with any of this. The whole coven thing was totally made up. She was just jealous that Lindsay was dating Jackie. Irenia had previously dated Jackie, and they had broken up, and Irenia still wanted to get back together, but Jackie didn't. And so now that Jackie was with Lindsay, Irenia just couldn't handle it. And so, naturally, Irenia had constructed this whole thing about Lindsay being one of the dark witches in Claremont, Illinois, and she's cast this hex, and now you, my witches in this coven, you need to go and kill her. But, of course, Lindsay did not end up getting killed, and instead, it was the totally innocent person, Josh, the Army private, who had nothing to do with any of this, who got killed. In addition to Josh dying, David, the warlock from St. Louis, he died from the shotgun blast to his stomach. And then Josh's mother, who had been stabbed repeatedly by David, she would actually survive her attack. Irenia would ultimately be found guilty of first-degree murder, and she would be sentenced to 57 years in prison. Rick pleaded guilty to murder as well, and he was sentenced to 20 years. And a third member of the coven, who was not present for the attack, but who after the fact helped cover it up, they were sentenced to 32 years in prison. One of the most haunted places in the entire United Kingdom is this little nondescript farmhouse in rural Wales. In 1989, Bill and Liz Rich, who were newlyweds, moved into their dream home, this little farmhouse in Wales. And pretty much right away, terrifying things began happening to them. They began hearing these loud footsteps marching around their second floor, but as soon as they went up there, there'd be nothing. And then Bill and Liz began randomly waking up in the middle of the night, and at the foot of their bed would be this dark figure just staring at them. Bill and Liz were terrified, but their fear was ratcheted up tenfold when their neighbors began telling them about their home's very dark and insidious history. And not long after that, Bill began to change. To hear the full terrifying story, listen to the special 2-part bonus Halloween episode on the Bedtime Stories podcast. This episode is called The Curse of Heol Vanog. And be sure to follow and listen to the Bedtime Stories podcast wherever you get your podcasts to hear more bone-chilling stories. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast that has literally hundreds of stories just like this one, but many of them are only available on the podcast. Again, it's called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available on Amazon Music. Late on the afternoon of March 22nd, 2015, 29-year-old Denise Huskins reached for her buzzing cell phone, and when she saw who was texting her, she immediately felt this knot of anxiety in her stomach. It was her on-again, off-again boyfriend, Aaron Quinn, and right now, at least according to Denise, they were off, and likely it was going to stay that way. But now, Aaron was texting Denise, saying he really wanted to talk to her and would she please come over. It was a Sunday, and Denise was home alone in her little apartment in Vallejo, California, which is inside the San Francisco Bay Area, and Denise really just did not have it in her to go talk to her ex-boyfriend. Really, she didn't have plans to go out anywhere. She just wanted to stay in. And so she typed back that she was in for the night and this would have to wait. But as soon as she sent that text, immediately she got another text from Aaron. For a long minute, Denise just sat there on the couch looking at her phone, wondering what she was going to do. Denise and Aaron had met the previous summer after Denise had moved to Vallejo from Boston, Massachusetts to work at a hospital in Vallejo called Kaiser Hospital. Denise had her PhD in physical therapy, and Kaiser Hospital had a great physical therapy program, especially for people with brain and spinal cord injuries. And Kaiser Hospital was also where Aaron worked. She and Aaron had been immediately attracted to each other. Aaron was tall and fit with dark hair and piercing eyes, and he loved to cook. And Denise, she was blonde and blue-eyed and very outdoorsy and driven. And so pretty much right away, Aaron and Denise would get into these intense conversations where they each would kind of dive into the other person's life. I mean, they were really connecting on a deep level. But even though they both clearly got along great and they were really connecting, their relationship got off to kind of a rocky start. Aaron had actually been engaged to be married before he met Denise, but Aaron's fiance had cheated on him, and so he had ended the relationship, and it was during that time, right after this relationship had ended, that he met Denise. And so Denise was kind of like a rebound, and she kind of felt like a rebound, but again, they're getting along great, and so both were optimistic that it was more than that. And so Aaron and Denise had officially begun dating in the fall of 2014, but 7 months later, so in March of 2015, when Denise was getting these text messages from Aaron, at least in Denise's mind, their relationship really was done. Because Denise had caught Aaron texting his ex-fiance, basically begging her to get back together with him. And so Denise felt really hurt. You know, she understood that that was a really intense relationship. And of course, Aaron would still have feelings for his ex to some degree, but she felt really betrayed. And so she told Aaron that that was it. But it was really painful for Denise because she did love Aaron, even though she knew, this relationship likely wasn't going to work. And now here Aaron was blowing up her cell phone with text messages to meet up and talk, and he just wasn't taking no for an answer. And so Denise finally typed out this long message back to Aaron, basically saying, look, I don't feel comfortable coming to your house. It's the house that you shared with your ex. I don't want to go there. We can talk another time. I think for right now, what you need to focus on, Aaron, is kind of like recording me. Take me out on dates and show me that you really want to be with me, because right now there's no trust. And Aaron, to his credit, wrote back to Denise and basically said, yes, I'm definitely willing to do that. I want to put in the work to win you back. I care about you, Denise. But he said, I really have something important to tell you, and I just don't feel comfortable talking about it anywhere else besides at my house. So please, can you just come over tonight? It's really important that I see you. And at first, Denise really did just kind of hold the line, and she told Aaron that, no, I'm not going to come to your house. But again, Aaron, he just would not let it go, and he really seemed actually very eager to see Denise, and it made Denise feel special, and so eventually she kind of gave it up and said, you know what? Okay, I'll come by. And after that, Denise got up off the couch, she got dressed, she called their favorite pizza place and ordered some pizza that she would pick up and bring to his house for them to eat that night, and then she headed out to her car and pulled out of her driveway. At about 5:30 p.m. that night, Denise arrived at Aaron's two-story home on Mare Island, which is actually just a little peninsula in Vallejo, California. And Denise, she grabbed the pizzas off the passenger seat, she grabbed her overnight bag because she was optimistic that, they're about to have a great talk and maybe rekindle and maybe she'll stay the night. And so with her things and her pizza, she walked up to the front door and knocked. The next day was a Monday, and Aaron and Denise were both scheduled to work at the hospital that day. But at around 7 a.m. that morning, Aaron called into the hospital sick and said he couldn't come in, and Denise sent a text message to her boss saying that a family emergency had just come up and she would not be at work all week. When Denise's boss got this text message, immediately he was like, this doesn't make any sense. First of all, Denise never missed work, so this was totally anomalous. And he also knew that Denise was applying for this very prestigious orthopedic fellowship that she needed to submit the paperwork for by Friday, and he knew she had a lot of work to do on this paperwork that basically required her to be at work that week to get it all done. And so if she was missing the week, then it looked like she would not be applying for this fellowship. And that just seemed totally unusual because Denise was really serious about this fellowship. And so Denise's boss wrote back to her and just said, I understand you have an emergency, we're here if you need us, take whatever time you need. And then a few hours later, her boss checked his phone again and he saw that she had not written him back. And so Denise's boss was like, wow, I guess, she really must be dealing with some serious family emergency that's keeping her from using her phone. About 7 hours later, at around 2 p.m. on this Monday, where Aaron and Denise have not shown up for work, there was a 911 call that came into the Vallejo Police Department. And the person making the 911 call was Aaron. And Aaron's voice was totally slurred, and then he told this very confusing story about some sort of kidnapping, and then he begged police for help. 2 police officers happened to be near Mare Island, where Aaron lived, and so within 2 minutes of this 911 call coming in, those 2 officers were knocking on Aaron's front door. And when Aaron let them inside, these officers noticed 3 things in quick succession. The first was Aaron was obviously drunk or high. He was under the influence of some substance. He just did not seem right. 2, there were at least a dozen empty beer bottles lining a back wall in the kitchen. And 3, the entire house reeked of cleaning chemicals. One of the officers immediately turned to Aaron and said, "Are you on drugs?" And Aaron would say, "Yes, I am on drugs, but these drugs were given to me by the kidnappers." The officers immediately exchanged confused glances, looked back at Aaron, and then just said, okay, well, we're going to take a look around. And so the officers wound up going upstairs, and as they went upstairs, that cleaning chemical smell got stronger and stronger, and they made their way into the master bedroom, and they saw the ground had obviously been recently vacuumed, and that cleaning smell was really strong in here. The sheets on the bed were all gone, except for the fitted sheet that sat over the mattress. And so the officers were about to leave the master bedroom and keep looking when one of the officers stopped and he noticed something on the bed, and he called the other officer over, and they walked over and they looked down, and sure enough, on the bed was about a quarter-sized drop of blood. The police officers left the master bedroom and they went back downstairs where Aaron was, and they walked up to him and said, okay, tell us again what happened with these kidnappers and what's going on here. And Aaron would launch into a totally bizarre story. Through slurred speech, Aaron would say 12 hours earlier, so around 3 in the morning that morning, so early Monday morning, Aaron said he was in his house with his girlfriend, Denise, when suddenly these men wearing wetsuits broke into the house, and they immediately tied up Aaron and Denise and then made them wear these goggles that had been all taped up, so once they were on your face, you couldn't see anything. Aaron would tell the police that the intruders, in addition to wearing wetsuits, they also were carrying guns, tasers, also laser pointers, and also very high-powered flashlights. And so when they came in, there were all these lights and beams everywhere. I mean, it was totally chaotic. Aaron then explained to police that after he and Denise had been tied up and had these goggles on, the men in wetsuits came over to them and put headphones on each of them, and then they played this recording, which had this weird, soothing music, and then somebody narrating, telling Aaron and Denise that they were not in any danger, that this was just a robbery, and to stay calm and nothing would happen to them. And so Aaron and Denise had done just that. They tried to follow orders, and then at some point the headphones came off, and both Aaron and Denise were told to go to separate rooms, and they kind of fumbled their way into the separate rooms, at which point the men demanded they give up their banking information and passwords, and Aaron and Denise did that. They gave up all their banking info, and then Aaron and Denise were brought back into the living room. They were tied back up again, and then even though Aaron and Denise couldn't actually see this, they heard the sound of somebody lady apparently coming in that sounded like a doctor, who then took Aaron and Denise's blood pressure before administering this drug to them that made them both very sleepy. And then before Aaron and Denise passed out from this drug, Denise was taken by the intruders, and the intruders told Aaron that they had rigged a camera system inside of his house to watch him so he couldn't leave to go save Denise. And so Aaron basically just stayed in the house until he fell asleep from this drug. And then when he woke up again and managed to get his restraints off, he saw that Denise really was gone. And so Denise had to be with the kidnappers. After Aaron was done telling this totally weird story, which again, you got to remember, as he's talking, he sounds totally drunk. And so they kept having to ask him to say again what he was saying. And, Aaron's just kind of loopy. And so the whole thing is just so weird. And so when Aaron was finally done telling the story, the two officers just stared at him in silence, and then the officers looked at each other, and without even saying anything, they both were thinking the same thing. Probably this guy has killed his girlfriend, Denise, and after he killed her, he must have spent time cleaning the house, which is why they smelled all the cleaning chemicals, and then maybe when he was done, he felt bad about what he had done, and so he began drinking beers to kind of cope with what he had done, and that's why all those empty bottles were there, and that's why he was acting so drunk right now. And then at some point, he had worked up the courage to call 911 and pretend that he didn't know where his girlfriend was and make up this whole alibi about these weird kidnappers that came in and did this stuff. But obviously, it was just a ruse. This guy killed his girlfriend. That's what happened. And so finally, one of these officers spoke to Aaron and they said, "You're going to need to come to the station with us and explain yourself." As much as I love whipping up old Wong's favorite meal, a nice hot frappe mug of musk. A nice hot frappe mug of muskox and blobfish stew. Sometimes I just don't have enough time. And when that happens, my quick option is a couple of mystery bird nuggets. However, as we learned last night, old Sigalung is allergic to emu. Emu was the mystery bird we sucked down last night. So unfortunately, mystery bird nuggets are out. However, I found an even better quick option, Factor. With Factor, you can skip all those grocery store trips and all the prepping and chopping and cleaning up that comes with preparing a full meal, but you still get the top-notch flavor and nutritional quality that you need. Factor's fresh, never frozen meals are ready in just 2 minutes, so all you gotta do is heat and enjoy. And Factor is flexible. I can adjust my order size to make sure I have enough to share with my family, and it's easy to skip a week or two anytime you know you're not gonna be around. For those of you who are confused, because I've previously stated my favorite meal kit is HelloFresh, well, don't worry, HelloFresh owns Factor, because HelloFresh wants to offer a wider array of meal options to satisfy all of their customers. So if you're in need of a quick meal option to replace your mystery bird nuggets, then look no further than Factor. My favorite Factor meal is the grilled chicken with browned butter Yukon mash. It's pretty good. Head to factor75.com or click the link down below and use code MrBallen50 for 50% off your first Factor box. It didn't take long for the police in Vallejo to launch this massive search all over Mare Island to look for Denise. And at this point, they were kind of looking for a body because based on what was going on in Aaron's house and the story he told, it did seem like very likely she had been murdered and disposed of somewhere. And so they had dogs out and dive teams out in the water. They had hundreds of volunteers looking everywhere. And at the same time, Aaron was brought to the police station and they began going over every single detail of his story, trying to get more information about these kidnappers, because as much as they didn't believe him, they did need to officially rule out that there was no kidnapping. And so they needed all the information about these kidnappers, who they were, what they looked like, what they sounded like, everything. And at the same time, police were talking to Aaron. Police also brought in Denise's roommate, and they asked the roommate, "Do you know anything about Denise's relationship with Aaron?" And the roommate would say, those two have had a very troubled relationship. And the roommate would say that, as far as they understood, Aaron and Denise were not a couple anymore. And so police would actually go over to Aaron in the police station and they would say, hey, we have people saying that you and Denise, who you called your girlfriend, you guys were not dating. You had broken up, explain yourself. And Aaron would say, well, actually, that's why Denise was coming over. Before all this kidnapping happened, she was coming over so we could reconcile. And we did. We had reconciled. We were back together when the kidnappers in wetsuits came inside the house. But the more police looked into Aaron's kidnapping story, the less it made sense. And it really didn't make sense to begin with. And so really, it just got weirder and weirder and weirder. Like, for one, Aaron said that he and Denise had been kind of forced to give up their banking information and their passwords. And they did that. They gave that up to the kidnappers. But when police looked into Aaron and Denise's banking records, there was no money withdrawn. The only activity on either of those accounts was on Aaron's account. 2 hours before Aaron called 911, he called his credit card holder and attempted to get them to give him a large cash advance so he could buy a boat. When police asked Aaron about the strong cleaning chemicals smell in his house, Aaron absolutely denied doing anything to clean his house. He didn't know how that happened. Also, Aaron would tell police that these kidnappers had actually wanted a ransom to be paid to them. But he said it was only for $8,500. And so police are like, why would these kidnappers take Denise and run away with her and risk very serious jail time for $8,500? It just seemed way too low for what they were doing. And then there was another weird detail that came out of interviewing Aaron at the police station. One of the police officers had noticed that Aaron's eyes were totally dilated, his pupils were huge, and for a little while, police had thought maybe that was because he was on some drug or something which can cause your pupils to dilate. But based on the weirdness of the story that Aaron was relaying to them, they actually began to suspect that Aaron was having a schizophrenic break. That is a symptom of a schizophrenic break. Schizophrenia is a very serious mental illness that often begins to appear in young adults, and Aaron was only 30 years old, so he's at the right age for this to happen. And while schizophrenia does not make people violent, it does make people very paranoid, and it also can cause hallucinations and mental disturbances. And so when police were looking at the details of Aaron's story about men in wetsuits breaking into his house and taking his blood pressure before stealing his girlfriend, but also cleaning his house at some point, that just seemed so weird and kind of crazy that it did seem to kind of line up with schizophrenia. By 9 p.m. on March 23rd, so 7 hours after Aaron had called 911 to report Denise missing, the Vallejo police decided they needed to call in the FBI because this was just so weird, and we have this missing person who could have been kidnapped, or maybe they're dead or hurt or something. I mean, there was just so much going on with this case, they needed backup. And when the FBI arrived in Vallejo, the first thing they did is they took Aaron and they gave him a lie detector test, and he failed it completely. And after finding out he had failed it completely, he immediately lawyered up. By the next day, March 24th, there were over 100 different search teams all across Mare Island and around Vallejo, California, looking for Denise. Police sonar had also picked up a body-sized mass out in the bay, but so far the divers had not been able to find it. Aaron, by this point, had gotten his lawyer and left the police station, and by now, Denise's picture was all over the news and newspapers. It was up on posters, on telephone poles all over town, and TV news channels were parked outside of Aaron's house, just waiting for him to come out or waiting for any activity. But despite all this activity, the detectives and the FBI agents that were working this case had really not made any significant progress. All they thought was, Aaron's definitely hiding something. But then something changed. A little bit after noon on March 24th, a reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle, who was camped outside of Aaron's home, got a very weird email. The email was from the kidnappers, the wetsuit-wearing, blood pressure-taking kidnappers who broke into Aaron's home and took Denise. And in this email to the reporter, it said that Denise was fine, and there actually was a recording of Denise's voice reading that day's news, which confirmed that she was alive at least as recently as that morning. But there were two very suspicious things about this email. The first one was the recording of Denise's voice, the proof of life recording. Well, she did not sound in any way stressed. She sounded utterly calm, like she was reading the news, like it was completely no big deal.
Earlier today, there was a plane crash in the Alps.
And the second thing that was very suspicious was the email address the kidnappers had used to message this reporter was an email address that belonged to Aaron. When this reporter told police about this, investigators were like, you know what, this actually doesn't make this any more clear. This makes things exponentially more confusing. Denise did appear to be alive, which was a good thing, but it now really appeared that Aaron was involved in whatever was going on here, and based on how calm Denise sounded on this recording, she could be involved in it too. And investigators' suspicions only grew when they went to Aaron and they asked him, have the kidnappers tried calling you at any point? And Aaron would say, yes, they have. And he showed them his phone. Well, the police would trace the phone calls that Aaron claimed had come into his cell phone from the kidnappers. And when they traced the kidnapper's number, they found it was connected to a burner phone. A burner phone is something that like drug dealers will use because it's totally anonymous. It's like a one-time use cell phone that you use temporarily, you have this number temporarily, and then when you're done with the phone, there's no history that you personally had that cell phone. But police were clever and they figured out where this burner phone was actually purchased from, and it was purchased from a nearby Target, and they looked at the security footage of around the time when this burner phone was purchased from this Target, and they saw the person who had bought it walk out of the store. And the person who had bought this burner phone was this white man who was tall and fit with dark hair, and it basically looked exactly like Aaron. And then 2 days later, on March 25th, Denise herself walked up to her mother's home in Huntington Beach, California, which is roughly 400 miles south of Vallejo, California, where she went missing. And so Denise's mother was not home when Denise showed up on her doorstep. And so Denise wound up going to the next door neighbor and using their phone to call her father. And Denise's story that she would tell her dad was even more bizarre than Aaron's story. She said she had been held captive by 4 men in this small room, and these men would tell her that they were simply doing a task for a client, and what they were doing now with her was just following their protocol. Denise would tell police that she was well taken care of while she was in captivity. They let her eat food, they gave her water, they even let her shower and brush her teeth. Denise initially was very open to speaking to Vallejo police detectives about what happened to her, but when they said the FBI really wanted to talk to her and they would literally send a jet to her in Huntington Beach and fly her back to Vallejo, she refused. And then, like Aaron, she immediately lawyered up and stopped talking. And so by this point, all the investigators are like, there's no way these two actually got kidnapped. This whole thing is some weird, elaborate hoax, and now they know they've been caught, and so they're going quiet. And so that night that Denise was found on March 25th, the Vallejo police held a press conference and told the public that they do not believe these two were ever kidnapped. They don't really know what happened, but at this point they are not pursuing kidnappers, and the public should not be worried about rogue kidnappers in the area. But after this press conference, the police couldn't help but think to themselves, why would these two people who are successful, they come from good families, they have loads of future prospects, their lives were good. Why would they stage this hoax? What do they stand to gain? It really just didn't make any sense. For weeks, the investigation into whatever happened to Aaron and Denise continued, but there was virtually no progress. The media was still very interested in this case. It was totally salacious, and they had dubbed this case the Gone Girl case in reference to a movie about a woman who fakes her own kidnapping. As for Denise and Aaron, they stayed lawyered up, and the only message they put out to the public was that they were telling the truth. And so really, this case just didn't make sense to anybody until about 2.5 months later, on June 5th, 2015. Early that morning, a police officer in a town called Dublin, which is just south of Vallejo, California, found a piece of evidence that basically broke the Gone Girl case wide open. The evidence this police officer found was a cell phone. Not a burner phone that's totally anonymous, but a real cell phone that is registered with a phone company and therefore is registered with an individual person. And police were able to trace this cell phone back to its owner. And this discovery would lead investigators 200 miles to the northeast of Vallejo to the small remote cabin in South Lake Tahoe, California. And at this cabin, police would find a stolen car, a white Mustang. And the white Mustang actually belonged to someone who lived in Vallejo. And so, with their guns drawn and their dogs at the ready to be released, the police and the FBI, they opened up the door to this cabin, and inside was a tall, fit, and slender white man with dark hair. The cabin was a total mess, with discarded food and trash and piles of clothes everywhere, but none of that really stood out to the police. Instead, what stood out to them as they're yelling at this guy to stay where he is all around the cabin, all over the ground, kind of on top of all the trash and mess, were things like laser pointers and high-powered flashlights and zip ties and goggles, like swim goggles, with tape all across the front of them blocking out your view. The police had finally found one of the kidnappers. And while this kidnapper looked exactly like Aaron, he was a tall, fit, slender white man with dark hair, it wasn't Aaron. In fact, neither Aaron nor Denise had ever met this person, and this person, this kidnapper, had never met Denise or Aaron. There was absolutely no connection between them. This kidnapper's name was Matthew Muller, and he was a 38-year-old Harvard-trained lawyer and former Marine who had totally just crashed and burned out of his law practice and then took up this life of committing all these totally bizarre crimes. It would turn out the totally weird stories that Aaron and Denise had told police about what had happened to them was all true. The only thing they got wrong was there wasn't multiple people breaking into the house in wetsuits. It was only ever one person. It was Matthew Muller, the guy behind all this. And maybe just kind of in their panic and not knowing what's going on, Aaron and Denise had kind of thought, oh, there's multiple people here. But there wasn't. It was just Matthew. Also, it would turn out Aaron and Denise were not the first people that Matthew had done this to. The reason that police officer in Dublin, California had found that cell phone, which broke the case wide open and led police to this cabin in South Lake Tahoe, was because on the night that officer found the cell phone, so June 5th, Matthew Muller had attacked another couple in the middle of the night in their home. But that couple had been able to fight Matthew Muller off, and Matthew had dropped his cell phone in their home before he fled. And so when this couple had reported this to police, that was how they got that cell phone. In terms of Muller's motivation for doing what he was doing, well, Muller was absolutely brilliant, like borderline genius, super smart guy, but he was extremely mentally unwell. He had severe psychosis, and he was also bipolar. And so basically he wasn't seeing reality for what it was. And at some point in one of his kind of psychotic fits, he had somehow came across Aaron and Denise and become absolutely obsessed with them. He began surveilling them nonstop with a drone for 3 weeks before he attacked them, learning their patterns and who they talked to and what they did. And in fact, Aaron, when he found out that was what Matthew was doing, watching him and Denise with a drone, Aaron would tell police, oh my goodness, I actually remember one night before the kidnapping looking up and seeing this glinting light in the sky, and he thought, that looks like a drone, why is it out here? But Aaron was a normal person and didn't suspect that somebody who was totally unhinged was spying on him with a drone, and so he had forgotten about it. And so after Muller had surveilled Aaron and Denise for 3 weeks using his drone, he was ready. And so in the middle of the night, he broke into Aaron's house wearing a wetsuit. He tied up Aaron and Denise, and he put those goggles on both of them so they couldn't see anything. And then he put on those headphones on both of them that played the soothing music and also had that narration where it was telling them, hey, you're going to be fine. This is a robbery. Just stay calm and do what you're told. But after these headphones went on both of them, Matthew would sexually assault Denise.
In our sight, we've conquered shadows, reach the light. No more sorrows, just a flight onto bright tomorrows. We unite. Rotten seemed high, but now I can see. With strength and heart, we broke free. Night turned to dawn, stars lit our path, but we're moving on. No looking back.
And in fact, at least one other victim of Matthew Muller has come forward since his arrest to say that she too was sexually assaulted by Matt. And so after Matt had taken Denise and left Aaron's house with her, Aaron, he did fall asleep from the drug he was given from Matthew. And then when he woke up the next morning, he managed to get out of his restraints. And, he's still affected by the drug that was in his system. And he sees that Denise is gone. And so the first thing he does is, oh my God, I need to find a way to pay the ransom to this kidnapper. Because again, the kidnapper, Matthew, had said around Aaron that he wanted $8,500. And so Aaron thought he could get that money. And so he called his credit card company and asked for that cash advance for $8,500 to pay this ransom. But when they asked Aaron why he needed this money, he didn't want to give up that it was for a ransom because he didn't want the kidnapper to know that he had talked to authorities. He was worried about Denise. And so kind of in a panic, Aaron just told the credit card company that he was buying a boat, but really it was for the ransom. Also, Aaron was the one who called in to Kaiser Hospital for both him and Denise, saying they were missing work. He did this because Matthew at some point had instructed Aaron that he would have to do that or something would happen to Denise. And so again, he's just kind of following the instructions, hoping that he can get Denise back. As for the email that the San Francisco Chronicle reporter got that apparently was from the kidnappers, but was sent from Aaron's email account, well, that really was the kidnapper, Matthew Muller, sending this email to the reporter. He just used a special program to basically hijack Aaron's email address. And as for Denise sounding very calm in her proof of life recording that was attached to that email, well, the thought is Denise was very likely in shock at the time she was asked to record this, and so it sounded like she was relaxed, but really she wasn't. Also, just a random side note that I'm sure some of you will have questions about. We don't know why Aaron's house smelled like chemicals. It's assumed that, maybe when Aaron and Denise were all tied up and couldn't see anything because of their goggles, that Matthew Muller, I guess, walked around their house and cleaned it, but we don't know for sure. Matthew Muller is currently serving a 40-year sentence in prison for federal crimes, and just recently he was sentenced to an additional 31 years in prison for state crimes that were in connection to the kidnappings of Aaron and Denise. Aaron and Denise would go on to sue the city of Vallejo, California for basically mistreating them. They had been telling the truth the whole time, but nobody took them seriously, and they would win $2.5 million. Aaron and Denise would go on to get married, they would have a baby, and they would write a book together about their experience, which is called Victim F, From Crime Victims to Suspects to Survivors. Just after 1:30 in the morning on May 12, 1994, a young girl ran out the front door of her home in rural Maine out into the rainy night. Barefoot and terrified, the girl went door to door screaming for help, but no one heard her. Finally, after running nearly 2 miles in the dead of night, she arrived in her little downtown and managed to flag down a restaurant owner. The owner would help the girl call 911, and within minutes, the police would arrive at that young girl's home. And what they would discover there was one of the most horrific crimes ever committed in that small town. Not only because of its sheer brutality, but also because of who committed it and why. We tried to make this story make sense, but sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, where we have literally hundreds more stories just like this one, many of which are only available on the podcast. Again, it's called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available on Amazon Music.